Anther and pollen production. Anther is made up of two sepals alongside with inner tissue which lies from the base of anther to its top. Anther like two cylindricals connected by one another with some connective tissue which lies from base to its top. This tissue surrounds the vascular bundle. Vascular bundle is xylem and phloem which transport necessary materials to upward to the anther of plant. Each of the anther or splits, we take a cross section from anther. We see a structure look like a butterfly maybe. Each of the splits separated into two, the right split and the left split. Each of the split consists of two compartments or chambers. We call them the pollen sac or the microsporangium. Pollen sac and microsporangium is the same structure but in different duration, at different stages of male reproductive cell formation. So when there are pollens in it, we call it pollen sac, but before pollen sac contain microspores, which are previous level of male reproductive cell formation, known as microsporangium. When the anther gets mature, the connective tissue between two compartments dissolve. As the connective tissue between two compartments dissolve, two compartments become one compartment like, and then the external wall of anther split and the pollens will be ready to spread to the environment. This is like a summary of anther or the male reproductive cell formation. If we study in details about the male reproductive cell formation in anther, at the beginning pollen sac we may remember it's one of four compartments in splits of anther, contains a microspore, mother cell, microspore, mother cell with diploid number of chromosomes. The microspore mother cell divide by meiosis to form four haploid microspores with n chromosome microspore. So the stage when this compartments contain microspore, we call it microsporangium. The nucleus of microspore divides in an ordinary way, and each new nucleus will be covered with cytoplasm to form tube cell and generative cells. Each of this microspore undergo mitosis, was the external wall, cellulosic wall not split, nucleus division after cytokinesis, and form two cells which are haploid. One of these cells called as the tube cell because in feature it formed the pollen tube, and this one the generative cell because in next level it forms the or generated two male reproductive cell sperms. This male reproductive organ make the structure, we call it immature male gametophyte, and a plant part which make male reproductive cell but immature because male reproductive cell sperms are not formed yet. The pollen spread from anther the outside, approximately 100 numbers in each anther. The pollens are covered by a thick wall with horns to help pollens to stick the surface of stigma, and also they are rough surfaced. This having horns and being with rough surface, it make connection of pollen grain to the surface of female reproductive organ pistil, which we call it stigma. In different plants there are different shape and structure of pollen grains, but pollen grains contain number of thin regions known as the germination pores. We may remember these germination pores from the comparison between prokaryotic monocotyledon and dicotyledon plants. When there is only one single pore, it's monocotyledon, but if there are two of them, it's dicotyledon plants. Germination pores, because the tube cell absorb water and germinate through these tiny regions after fall or female reproductive organ. It summarizes the all male and female reproductive cell formation with pollination, fertilization, like a summary, whole reproduction in flowering plate, but we can make a summary after reproductive cell formation. And this figure also, like microsporangium, microspore cell are formed from microspore mother cell by meiosis, and then microspore cell undergo mitosis to form a cellulosic wall containing two cells, one generative cell and one tube cell. The generative cell generates the male reproductive cell sperms, and the tube cell in feature forms the pollen tube. Ovary and egg production. Pistil, which is female reproductive organ, together with ovary made from leaves called as carpel, leaves, one or many. If we draw a simple ovary in a flower, it may look like this. So there's only one compartment, one ovary, but only one chamber, one room. So this part we call it ovary wall. But some ovaries have no only one compartment, they may separate it, like if cross section of tomato we can see a structure in that form. Each of these cavities which contain seeds are carpels, like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 carpels, but all these carpels together they make the ovary. So one ovary can be made up of one carpel, the rooms we can see which contain the seed, or more than one. The carpel leaves represent the megasporophyle, where the eggs are attached to the ovary wall. The ovary wall, or that ovary wall or carpel leaves like a shell of megasporangia. This megaspore, because female reproductive cell in comparison is bigger than male reproductive cell, we use it microspore for male, but megaspore we use it for female. Eggs start growing by having a small hump called nucellus. And that form connected to the ovary wall through funiculus, a short neck which connects the nucellus, which is primary tissue in female reproductive cell formation. And this is covered by one or more layer of tissues, covered by, but except a small hole remain at the bottom which is not covered by tissue, and we call the small hole as micropyle. This micropyle will be used after for penetration of male reproductive cell into the embryo sac for fertilization and seed formation. So the micropyle is the hole which remains at the bottom or top of the nucellus. So a compound cell grow inside the nucellus called the megaspore mother cell. The megaspore, we said we call it megaspore because in comparison the female reproductive cell is bigger than male reproductive cell, and also chromosome number is diploid. This cell undergoes a meiosis in order to produce 4 megaspores with half number of chromosomes on the same line. To draw the same line, we draw an ovary, funiculus, nucellus grow. The one cell, megaspore mother cell, undergo meiosis to form 1, 2, 3, and 4 cells in same line with haploid number of chromosomes, and each of the cell we call them as megaspore. 3 of these megaspores disappear, and the 4th one remains, dissolve and dissolve and dissolve, but only one of this megaspore remain. This represents a female gametophyte which is immature because the egg mature female reproductive cell not formed yet, and the structure which contain this megaspores, we call it embryo sac. This will grow in size as long as the cytoplasm grows together with the nucleus and occupy most of the ovary. So if we draw it and big ovary like this, again funiculus, most of ovary occupied by it, and it covered by covering tissue, but only a small hole remain. The successive division takes place in the nucleus of the embryo sac, in resulting 8 nuclei in embryo sac. Said 3 megaspores are dissolved, one of them remain, but the remaining cell which enlarge in size fill the most of the ovary, and we call it embryo sac, which is immature female gametophyte. These cells undergo mitosis 3 times to form 8 nuclei. 2 of these nuclei positioned in center, 3 of them on opposite side of micropyle, and 3 of them on side of micropyle. The 3 nuclei organized near the micropyle, 3 nuclei at the opposite side, 2 of them remain at the center. The nuclei at the micropyle side covered by mesh to form the cells. The middle one represents the egg cell. 2 cells on left and right side of egg cell, we call them as synergid cells. At the opposite side of micropyle, the 3 cells or nuclei, we call them antipodals. And 2 central nuclei forms the polar nuclei. The embryo sac, because mature female reproductive cell formed and it is ready for fertilization, it represents the mature female gametophyte. When female gametophyte gets mature, the mature egg form in a mature embryo sac covered by a membrane, and nucellus with covering tissue, we show it in green color, and funiculus looks curved to the bottom in a way so macropyle, the follicles may take other positions. Not so important, but funiculus can be in different position, or curved or bended, but it's hold the embryo sac connected to the ovary wall. So as male reproductive cell which is immature, pollen grains are formed, then the female reproductive cell are got ready for fertilization. So now male reproductives need to be transported to female reproductive organ by a process known as pollination, which can be defined as transporting of pollen from anther to the stigma. Stigma is the top of female reproductive organ. Anther to cylindrical bags of male reproductive cell which contain number of pollen grain. As a result of transporting pollen grain to the surface of stigma, which covered by sticky substance to facilitate the adhesion of pollens, fertilization takes place in ovary. So the pollination is one of the operations which they produce the seed, because seed is formed as a result of fertilization. And there are 2 types of pollination, which is self-pollination and the cross-pollination. The self-pollination happens by transporting of pollen from anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower. And we draw maybe a plant like this. This plant has 2 flowers. If the pollen grain is transported from male part to female part in same flower, or female part of another flower but in same plant, it's known as self-pollination. So plants like wheat, barley, rice, cotton, beans, peas, and orange tree, they have ability of self-pollination. The cross-pollination, this kind of pollination happens by transition of pollen from anther of the time we need two different separated plants from flower in one plant and flower in another plant. So the transportation of pollen grain from flower of one plant to the stigma of flower in a separated plant which belong to same species is called cross-pollination. The cross-pollination is more important than self-pollination because the fruits are bigger in size and more in number. That's why farmers to have a bee advised to have bee house near their farm too. Why? To guarantee the cross-pollination and get a lot of and good quality products. So to cause questions, why cross-pollination is more important than self-pollination? Because the fruits are bigger, size is more size, bigger size, and more products with better quality are formed in cross-pollination. And to guarantee the cross-pollination, the farmers advise to have bee house near their farm. Why? Because the bees are most important insects that help pollination, and from bees are kind of insect, but not only bees, there are some other examples like beetles, butterflies also, they help pollination, cross-pollination in plant. In addition, wind, water play a role, and including humans sometimes can help plant for cross-pollination like in date trees. So the pollen tube formation is start when the pollen grain fall on the stigma, which is the final part of female reproductive organ. We draw embryo sac contain egg cell, 2 synergid cells, polar nuclei, and 3 antipodals. As the pollen grain fall on stigma, which is covered by sticky substance, and horns on the surface of pollen grain also with containing some thin regions called germination pores. After the pollen grain fall on the stigma, it absorbs water and the pollen tube extend through the germination pore, make a long tube through the style, extend to the ovary and connected to the embryo sac. As we remember, the embryo sac covered with a covering tissue, but only a small hole remain. We said it for penetration of male reproductive cells. So the tube cell form the pollen tube, and then the generative cell enter the pollen tube by on the half of way undergo mitosis to form 2 sperm cells, which are the male reproductive cell, and haploid in chromosome number. So when the sperm cells are formed, the pollen tube represent the mature male gametophyte. In this case, they are ready for fertilization. Now, male is ready for fertilization, and also egg, because formed in embryo sac, also it's ready for fertilization. These 2 sperms, they move through the pollen tube, extend, and after pollen tube release its content into the embryo sac. One of the sperm cells fertilize the polar nuclei, one of the fertilize the egg. Egg plus the sperm, it forms the zygote, and the polar nuclei, which is 2n plus one of the sperm cells, which is N haploid chromosome. It forms the endosperm nucleus, and zygote undergo mitosis to form embryo, which is a minimized organism, and endosperm also forms endosperm tissue. And at the same time, two sperm cells fertilize two different cells. Two fertilization happen at the same time, so we call it double fertilization. So double fertilization, a process in which two sperm cells, one of them fertilize the egg cell to form the zygote, and the next sperm cell fertilize the polar nuclei to form endosperm nucleus or endosperm cells, which is a distinctive feature for flowering plants. But in non-flowering plants, the double fertilization does not happen. The endosperm tissue become tissue. It stores the food to nourish the embryo until germination. For fertilization and embryo development, we said two sperm cells. One of them fertilize the egg to form zygote, and one of them fertilize the polar nuclei to form the endosperm nucleus. So endosperm nucleus triploid, two from polar nuclei and one from sperms. These two fertilization, which happen at the same time, we call it double fertilization, with a distinguished characteristic of flowering plants. Then the antipodal cells, synergid cells, and tube cells disappear. Zygote start normal division mitosis to form embryo. The endosperms undergo normal mitotic division to form endosperm tissue, which contain nutrients to be used by embryo during growth. This figure, it summarizes the male and female reproductive cell formation, including fertilization, fruit formation. Completely, we call it alternation of generation, which is a reproduction method in plants. So, female reproductive organ, stigma, style, and ovary contain ovules which connected the ovary wall by funiculus. The primary tissue which form female reproductive cell is nucellus, which is in the form of a small hump, contain a compound cell which is megaspore mother cell. Peristome meiosis to form megaspores, which are haploid chromosome number. Then three of these megaspores are disappear or decompose. One of them remain, which undergo mitosis division 3 times, form 8 nuclei, and then each of them covered by some amount of cytoplasm. At side of micropyle, the central cell is egg cell, which two adjacent cells, we call them synergid cells. In center, two polar nuclei with antipodal cells on opposite side of micropyle. And we said this embryo sac, it represents the mature female gametophyte, and it is ready for fertilization. The anther, which is cylindrical bag located at the top of the filament, consists of two split two sides, which each of them contain 2 compartments, contain microspore mother cell, which is diploid epistemic meiosis to form 4 microspores. Each of these microspores, none of them dissolve. Pesteromitosis, nucleic division by cellulose wall not split. So 2 cells, generative cell and tube cell, formed covered one single cellulosic wall, and have some thin regions in wall for germination of tube cell. Then we call these thin regions as germination pores. Pollination is the transportation of pollen grain to the top of the female reproductive organ, the stigma. Except there are 2 types of pollination: the self-pollination between the parts of same flower or 2 flowers in same plants, and transportation from one plant or to another between 2 separated plants. That's a cross-pollination, and it is more important than self-pollination, because Fruits are formed by cross-pollination, are bigger in size, more in number, and better in quality. So the farmers advised to have bee house near their farm to guarantee the cross-pollination. And the surface of the pollen grain, which is immature male gametophyte, has horns and rough surface, and also the surface top final part of female reproductive organ. The stigma is puffed up, covered with sticky substance to facilitate the adhesion of pollen grain. Transportation completed, then the tube cell absorb water, germinate through the germination pore, extend through the style long side until reach the micropyle, which is a hole for penetration male reproductive cell into embryo sac. On the half-way, the generative cell undergo mitosis to form two sperm cells. In that way, the tube cell represents the mature male gametophyte and transport two sperm cells into the embryo sac. One of them fertilize the egg cell to form zygote, and one of them fertilize the polar nuclei to form endosperm nucleus by mitotic division to form endosperm tissue, which stores food for embryo. In next stage, zygote pass through mygotic divisions to form embryo, and this structure, which contain endosperm, embryo, and covered with covering tissues, which we call it seed coat, makes a mature seed. And fertilization happen, it triggers or stimulate flower to form fruit. Then new seed formed, seed germinate into new complete sporophyte, form flower, male, female part, and the cycle turn, which we call it alternation of generation. So the flower represents the gametophyte, and the whole remaining part of vegetative parts are sporo,